Eccoci qui, sono molto lieto di dare a tutti voi il benvenuto a questo incontro del corso Agenda 2030, dedicato questa volta al goal numero 4, Istruzione di Qualità. È un appuntamento per noi molto importante perché siamo onorati di accogliere per questo quinto appuntamento il professor Fernando Reimers, dell'Università Harvard e per l'esattezza della Graduate School of Education. È per noi veramente un onore, caro professore, averla tra di noi, tanto più che il professor Reimers, e ne parlerà a breve, è l'autore di ben 3 monografie su un tema strettamente attinente a quello che ci occupa in questo corso, ovvero l'insieme delle iniziative coordinate sotto il nome di Agenda 2030. Il titolo dell'intervento del professor Reimers è Education Global Citizens to Improve the World, cioè per migliorare il mondo. E questo è un titolo, come dire, che tradisce una meravigliosa ambizione, migliorare il mondo. Avremmo definito questo progetto come assolutamente chimerico, fuori tempo, prima della pandemia. Adesso la pandemia ci ha in qualche modo ridato il coraggio di affrontare le grandi sfide radicali. Improve the world, migliorare il mondo. La vostra presenza così numerosa, di studenti a questo corso, dice bene la partecipazione a questa sfida e la condivisione di questa ambizione. È una cosa importantissima. D'altra parte non stupisce che uno dei primi goal dell'Agenda 2030 sia dedicato all'istruzione, istruzione abbinato al problema della sostenibilità. D'altra parte è fuori questione, ed è la lezione numero 1 della pandemia, è che la pandemia è frutto della insostenibilità degli equilibri, dei paradigmi, come si usa dire, che hanno governato il mondo finora, che una sostenibilità si darà soltanto nella misura in cui il sapere sarà riuscito a elaborare nuovi modelli di sviluppo. E il sapere può essere dato soltanto come frutto di una buona formazione. Cioè è all'università, nella fattispecie, che si accendono i laboratori, ma nei dipartimenti umanistici come in quelli scientifici, per trovare il modello di sviluppo che ci salverà, ovvero che will improve the world. Per questo penso che il titolo scelto dal professor Reimers, che di nuovo ringrazio della sua partecipazione e della sua presenza a questa bella iniziativa di Roma 3, questo corso interdipartimentale e interdisciplinare sull'Agenda 2030, è perfettamente in linea con quella che è la grande sfida, appunto, che è implicita e nel suo titolo e, come dire, che è implicita nel titolo del nostro corso. Dunque, di nuovo, grazie a Fernando Reimers di essere qui con noi, proveniente da una delle più prestigiose università del mondo, che veramente ci onora e che ci fa capire anche la considerazione in cui è tenuto questo corso che questa volta, come dire, tocca nella fattispecie il Dipartimento di Scienze della Formazione, diretto da Massimiliano Fiorucci, direttore al quale con molto piacere cedo la parola. Massimiliano, a te.
Grazie, magnifico Rettore, grazie per la presenza, grazie a te, al professor De Filippis per aver voluto fortemente questo corso interdisciplinare che è davvero una novità, ma che, come tutti potranno capire, è ormai una dimensione imprescindibile per la nostra formazione. Quindi credo davvero che questa iniziativa sia importante. Avremmo voluto svolgerla in presenza, anche questa, almeno per parte degli studenti. Ci auguriamo di poter reinvitare il professor Reimers nei prossimi anni, magari in presenza, sarebbe un piacere e un onore, però siamo particolarmente felici della sua presenza, perché è uno studioso che su questi temi di indiscusso prestigio, e io ho avuto la fortuna di conoscerlo qualche anno fa e ho avuto l'onore di redigere la prefazione ad un volume dal titolo Cittadinanza globale e sviluppo sostenibile, pubblicato in Italia, 60 lezioni per un curriculum verticale, che il professor Reimers ha sviluppato nell'ambito del suo corso universitario e che poi è stato tradotto e riadattato al contesto italiano da un gruppo di insegnanti italiani. Il volume è pubblicato dalla Pearson, è gratuito e scaricabile. Dopo vi darò l'indicazione del link dove scaricarlo, e il suo quadro introduttivo è molto bello, e poi ci sono degli esperimenti, dei percorsi didattici per le scuole. Ecco, ovviamente il tema dell'istruzione di qualità è un tema centrale, perché significa un'educazione di qualità, inclusiva, paritaria, che vuole promuovere le opportunità di apprendimento per tutti, per tutto il corso della vita. Sappiamo che la pandemia ha fatto emergere una serie di disuguaglianze, le ha portate alla luce con maggiore evidenza, ma sappiamo che l'Italia purtroppo, come nell'ambito della scuola, soffre di un alto tasso di dispersione scolastica, ha un altissimo numero di NEET, cioè quelli che non studiano, non lavorano, non sono in formazione, ha ancora pochi laureati in comparazione con i altri paesi europei. Quindi questo è un tema sicuramente centrale, che si collega chiaramente alla riduzione delle disuguaglianze e della povertà, perché poi gli obiettivi dell'agenda sono fortemente interconnessi, e quindi questo è il senso anche di un corso interdisciplinare a cui partecipano studenti di diversi dipartimenti, e quindi siamo davvero onorati e contenti di avere il professor Reimers, che ringrazio ancora per la sua presenza. Lascerei la parola invece al professor Carrus, che è il referente per questo corso del nostro dipartimento, quindi quello che ha costruito insieme al professor De Filippis, come tutti gli altri referenti, il percorso, e che ovviamente poi si farà carico anche del percorso, degli esami e di tutto ciò che comporta per gli studenti del nostro dipartimento. Non voglio rubare altro tempo perché abbiamo un ospite d'eccezione, quindi vi saluto e ringrazio ancora anche il Rettore per la sua presenza e il Professor Reimers per aver aderito a questa nostra iniziativa. Grazie.
Grazie. Io ringrazio di cuore anch'io il Rettore Pietro Marchi e il Direttore Fiorucci per la loro presenza e per la loro introduzione, e ovviamente ringrazio il Professor Reimers per aver accettato il nostro invito, e il Prorettore De Filippis, che sta dirigendo tutta questa operazione complicata, complessa, ma che fino adesso ci sta dando delle belle soddisfazioni. Adesso userò l'inglese per introdurre il collega professor Reimers, anche così per farlo sentire, diciamo, pronto a iniziare il suo speech. So, Fernando, I switch now to English, and I'm happy to introduce you and to give you the floor. The magnificent rector and the director Fiorucci have already well introduced your profile and your expertise on these themes, and also the importance of having your speech and your point of view on these issues. So I'm happy to welcome you to this lecture, to this course, and to give you the floor. So I'm sure that you will provide our students with a lot of inspiring ideas. So I look forward to hear your talk, and then after your talk we will collect some of the questions and comments from the audience, and we can have also a discussion. So please, Professor Reimers, the speech, the floor is to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Ringrazio il Rettore Pietro Marchi e il Professore Fiorucci e il Professore Giuseppe Carrus per quella generosa introduzione e per l'invito a tenere questa conferenza oggi qui. Sono molto onorato di far parte di questa importante iniziativa. Adesso passerò all'inglese. Thank you very much for this kind invitation to join this course. I think this is a remarkable initiative, and the topic of engaging universities and university students, not only in the study of the Sustainable Development Goals, but in discerning how to contribute to advancing those goals as students and after students, is a topic that is very much dear to my heart, and it's a topic that is reflected in a lot of the work that I have been doing over the last few years. I'll be referring to some of that. I would like to now share my screen, so I ask you to have a little patience with me to see if I can do that. Let me see, where do I go on the screen to share my screen? More actions, that's not what I want to do. All right, Fabrizio, can you tell me where do I look for? I lost the place where I could share my screen on the platform. Are you with me?
I think Fernando, your screen is already shared. At least.
Oh, wonderful!
In my panel, I see your screen. So.
Oh, fabulous, fabulous! So you can see my slides right now?
Yes.
Oh, marvelous!
Yeah.
Marvelous. Okay. Well, thank you so very much.
Great.
So you now see a big image of Corona, correct?
Exactly. That's
Yes.
correct.
Yes.
All right. So let me talk about the current moment. A little over a year ago, the Director General of the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus a global pandemic. And this is a global pandemic that has produced not only much harm, much devastation, a real global calamity health-wise, but it has had many ripple effects in all areas of society. A summer issue of the journal Foreign Affairs summarizes, I think, quite well that impact. It says, coronavirus is going to have multiple financial crises around the world because all the economic engines have been shut down at the same time. It is going to cause countries in the developing world to default on their debt because both diminish economic activity, diminishes revenue, tax revenue, but also because of the increased burden, financial burden of addressing the public health impact of the pandemic. It has caused a contraction in economic activity, recession, decline in global trade, increased unemployment, a disproportionate impact on lower income households. The World Bank had estimated in June 60 million people pushed into extreme poverty. More recent estimates are 120 million, and an increase in hunger. Furthermore, the economic recovery will be slow. Now, how has this pandemic impacted education, and how is it likely to impact education in the future? The first impact is that governments now have a new fiscal austerity. There is less money. That is the reason many of the responses to sustain education during this pandemic globally have been deficient because governments have had to innovate with very limited resources. There is also austerity experienced by individuals. Many people have lost their jobs because businesses have closed down, and many societies don't really have a social safety net. So there is more poverty, and that diminishes the support that families can provide to children when they go to school. There has been the health impact of life loss. Imagine if one of your relatives loses their life, the trauma that this will cause. And the fear of losing the life has created stress and anxiety, which has gone on for over a year. Imagine living with this fear. If you are a member of a vulnerable community, and maybe your parents don't have the luxury of staying home because the kinds of jobs they do are day jobs, and they require that they risk their lives. And imagine as a child thinking every day that you could lose one parent, or you could lose your life. Another impact has been the interruption of schools, which have caused not only learning loss, but also disengagement. Many students find it very difficult to be motivated to learn with the alternative arrangements that have been created. And lastly, there have been multiplier effects of this pandemic, ripple effects of this pandemic on other challenges. What are some of those challenges that existed before the pandemic? Educational challenges, challenges of social inclusion, challenges of competitiveness, challenges of social and violence, challenges of democratic governance, and challenges of climate change. So this is all to say that we are living a very special moment, a very serious moment for humanity. Look historically at past pandemics. Look at the pandemic a century ago, the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu in Germany contributed to the rise of Hitler to power. How? Because the pandemic contracted economic activity in Germany, diminished the resources available to municipalities. With the reduction in social services, a lot of people were pushed to the margins. They felt excluded. They felt like they didn't belong. And extremist groups, led by people like Adolf Hitler, began to sell a poisonous ideology, basically telling people that the reason they were hurting was somebody else's fault. And even though in 1918, when the pandemic arrived in Germany, nobody took Hitler seriously, he thought he was a clown, 15 years later, he was elected Chancellor of Germany. I'm not saying this pandemic is going to have that effect. I hope it doesn't, but it is going to complicate life. A year ago, I was getting ready to travel to Mexico to launch a new book. And one of my colleagues, a professor at the School of Public Health, an epidemiologist with which I collaborate on a program for ministers of education and health, told me, you should cancel your trip. He said, in fact, you should be preparing not to travel anywhere for the next 18 to 24 months. I said, what are you talking about? This was in February. He said, this is going to become a pandemic, and airplanes and airports are not very good places to be during a pandemic. So I began to pay attention to the figures, and I realized that he was right. So I reached out to colleagues in a number of international development organizations because I realized at the moment this could potentially create the biggest educational crisis in a century. We did not know how to educate when we couldn't meet face to face. So I wrote to the Director of Education of OECD, to the Director of Education of UNESCO, of the World Bank, and Andreas Schleicher from the OECD responded right away, like 15 minutes after he got my email. He said, let's talk on the phone. He said, what are you thinking? I said, I'm thinking this is a very dangerous moment. We could lose in the next couple of years all the progress that has been made educationally over the last 20 years, all the progress that has been made in access. He said, what do you think we should do? I said, I have no idea, but let's try to be helpful because education leaders at all levels, school principals, municipal directors of education, ministers of education are going to need guidance. So the first thing we did was a survey. We designed a survey, and on March 11th, when the director of the WHO announced a pandemic, we released the survey. And within 2 weeks, we published the document that you see at the left here, a framework to guide an education response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason we released that is because the main conclusion from that survey was that no one had any plan, and everyone anticipated just a real tragedy happening because they didn't know how we're going to teach kids, especially the poorest kids. So that framework, which you can consult, we used essentially to tell governments the last thing we should do should be to shut down education systems. Let's try to create alternative arrangements and let's have a strategy. And the strategy should be local. And in that framework, we suggested what the strategy would be. We said, you're going to have diminished capacity. You will not be able to teach everything that you had to teach. So you need to reprioritize. It's very important to pay attention to the emotional well-being of students because people are going to be under stress and they're going to be afraid. We said it's very important to lead using an approach that is inclusive because these are going to be times of great confusion and conflict. Anyway, we began to organize discussions on meetings like this one around the world. And thousands of people came to these meetings, from 3,000 to 5,000. I learned that you can only have 5,000 people in a Zoom meeting. And so those meetings were like big town hall meetings. And the reason people came is because everyone was looking for answers. But what I realized from those meetings is that it was very easy to describe. I mean, remember last March, April, the emergency rooms in the hospitals were full. We did not have enough ICUs. We didn't have any vaccine a year ago. We didn't know we were going to have the vaccine. So it was very easy to develop a very negative perspective. That's when I began to look historically at past pandemics. And that's when I became even more scared when I learned about what the Spanish flu had done in Germany. And so we concluded that we had to begin to put a spotlight on good things that were happening. Because even though in the middle of all this tragedy, there were people who were innovating, we said, let's begin to do some case studies that document any efforts to try to continue to educate, especially poor children. And let's just say how they're doing. And then we decided that we wanted to do more of them. So we reached out to friends at the World Bank and to friends at the organization 100. And we have published now 80 short case studies. You can find them on the link that I have placed here. Case studies that documented innovation. In May of last year, we did another survey. And the results of that report are in this here, Schooling Disrupted, Schooling Rethought, where we basically said, actually, what has changed? What did you do? And the story was a story of half empty and half full glass. The half empty was that certainly it had been impossible for anyone to teach in the same manner in which they were able to teach before. We rediscovered the power of face-to-face instruction, the power of the school. The story was also that in some countries, the countries that had invested in online learning, in building the capacities of teachers to teach online, capacities of students to learn online, countries like Finland, countries like Singapore, actually the pandemic had been a time of moving forward, of great innovation. They had lost very few days to classes. In other countries and for other children, this had been a terrible time because most kids did not have the opportunity to connect with online instruction. Teachers didn't have the skills to do that. And so children began to disengage from school, to just drop out of school. This happened in Brazil, this happened in Mexico, this happened in Chile. And so that's the story up until last year. Why am I sharing this story with you? Because it illustrates a point which I think is aligned with what your rector is doing with this SDG initiative. Most of these case studies, most of this research I did with my students. Essentially, when I reached out to colleagues and I said, what can I do? I didn't have a program. I didn't have a budget to do that. I only had my time, but I also had my students. And the first group that I reached to asking for help were my students. I said, I want to do these case studies. Would you help me? And that's how we're able to produce so many of these case studies. So the point I am making is the university has the capacity in a moment of real crisis to be of service to society, to be of real service to society. And it's important that universities do that for three reasons. Number one, because an adaptive challenge like a pandemic or like climate change or like some of the challenges I have described cannot be resolved by technical solutions. By definition, we haven't faced this problem before. The solutions have to be invented, but that invention shouldn't be an act of improvisation. That invention should draw on the best science, on the best use of reason, on the best use of evidence. And universities are the places that were created to advance that, to advance knowledge, to advance evidence. So universities are one of the few places that can actually help society at a moment, at a grave crisis like that. That's one reason they should do it. Second reason they should do it is because in engaging students in solving these problems, universities are helping the students develop some of the most important 21st century skills, which are the skills to take responsibility, to stand up and ask, how can I serve? The skills to be innovative, the skills to be creative, the skills to invent a solution to a problem that is new. The students who participate in those activities are gaining essential skills for their lives, the skills they're going to need for a world that is uncertain. This pandemic is not going to be the last crisis that these students face. The third reason universities should do this is because when we connect with society in trying to understand big problems, that helps us connect different parts of a university. It helps us connect the silos. So if you think about the three core missions of university, research, teaching, and outreach, responding to a tragedy like a pandemic is a wonderful way to activate those three missions and to integrate them and to produce synergies. There is an additional reason why universities should do that. We are living times that are very dangerous for democracy because a new set of populist ideas that devalue expertise, devalue universities, devalue democracy, devalue the rule of law are growing around the world. And this is a dangerous time for universities. One of the very first things that Hitler did was to begin to control universities when he rose to power. In general, tyrants don't like universities very much because universities are about teaching people to think for themselves. And people who think for themselves are very inconvenient to dictators. And so these ideas are increasingly questioning the value of universities, are questioning what do universities do for society. In the United States, recent surveys among adults show that trust of society in universities is decreasing quite considerably. 6 years ago, when adults were asked, do you think that universities contribute to society? 60% of Americans said yes. That number is now 50%. And these are surveys from the Pew organization, very similar results with surveys from Gallup. But I know similar things are happening elsewhere. So one reason why universities should engage their research, their teaching, and their outreach in solving social problems is to help educate the public about how they contribute to society. Let me move on to come back to the pandemic. The UN has characterized very well the gravity of this moment. This pandemic, these are words of the Secretary General, is more than a health crisis. It's an economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a security crisis, and a human rights crisis that has affected individuals, families, and societies, and it has augmented, increased, highlighted the vulnerabilities, the fragilities within and among nations. We now know how different circumstances children of different social classes live. We now know how difficult it is for some children to engage with their schooling because they live in crowded places. They have no devices, they have no time, they have no access to the internet, they live in toxic environments. And so it is no exaggeration, says the Secretary General of the UN, to suggest that our response to this pandemic will involve remaking and reimagining the very structures of societies and the ways in which countries cooperate for the common good. Coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society, whole of government, and whole of the world approach driven by compassion and solidarity. And I would add, and I believe universities are uniquely placed to lead this process. And so, what are some of the dividends of this dark moment for education? What are some of the possible silver linings? What are some of the good things that we can expect to see? I think there are 7. Number 1, we have realized that no one learns very much when they are afraid, when they are in stress. We have discovered that students are whole people, and that if we're going to educate them, you have to educate them holistically. You cannot just teach them content. You have to develop their social emotional well-being, because no one learns very much when they are in fear. When I think about the 70 case studies that my students and I and our colleagues at the World Bank and the OECD conducted, if there is one thing that all these innovations have in common, is that they all establish a mechanism to convey to children that there was someone in school that cared for them. Even places that work with street children who could only communicate with street children with WhatsApp. They would check in every day and said, how are you doing? How are things for you? Do you want to talk? And that recognition that we need to educate the whole child is very important for education. And I think it is going to be with us in the next decades. Second, I'm hoping that this pandemic has increased appreciation for the importance of science and of technology. It really is remarkable that in 1 year we have not 1, but 4 vaccines. It is a remarkable testimony to the power of science and of innovation to help us solve these problems. And of course, you realize that none of that would be possible without universities and without the research that is done in universities and in industry. But I think it's very important to underscore that, because one of the tenets of this dangerous populist movement is to devalue science. In the United States, the reason we are suffering so much is because our last president is someone who had very little respect for science and technology or for universities, and who basically told the public that they didn't have to wear a mask and they didn't have to follow the guidance of public health authorities. And that politicized very simple things that the public could have done. And that's why, on a per capita basis, the US is, I believe, the country in the OECD with more people who have died per capita. So there is going to be more appreciation for science and technology. There is going to be more appreciation of the importance of technology for instruction, for teaching. We're all going to be very interested in the development of digipedagogies. I will not say, we all, for the first time in the 30-some years I have been at Harvard, Harvard made the decision to teach our degrees online, our degree programs online. And we all moved into that environment. Was that the ideal way to move into it? Probably not. For many people, it was sink or swim. People who didn't know how to swim, they were told, here you go into the water, either you swim or you sink. But I think we're all going to realize that access to technology and connectivity in the 21st century is a basic human right. It's like access to water. It's like access to education. It's like access to electricity. And it's not possible to participate in the 21st century civically or economically if you don't have digital skills and if you don't know how to use technology or have access to technology. If you look at companies that invest in innovation around the world, over the last year, there is more money to invest in education technology than good ideas to use that. The investors are sensing that this field is moving very rapidly into embracing technology in ways it hadn't done before. A fourth strand is most schools have had to develop more communication with homes. And there are some good things that come from that. I think there is a greater knowledge, understanding on the part of teachers of the conditions that their students live in, and a greater appreciation of the parents, because frankly, the only reason some students have been able to learn is because their parents have helped them. There is probably also more appreciation on the part of parents, of teachers, and of what schools do. I think we have realized that for all its shortcomings, this public school, was able to do a lot of things that we were just not able to replace with these arrangements that we put in place in a hurry over the last year. There's been a lot more collaboration among teachers, not only with each other in their schools, but with colleagues in other schools and with other institutions. And that's very good. I'm hoping that good things will come from that. Let me talk about another pandemic, the pandemic in Italy of the 14th century. Terrible plague, the Black Death it was called, the bubonic plague. I think in 1 year, it had wiped out 1/3 of the Italian population. And of course, that pandemic, like this pandemic, produced terrible things. But I think it also produced some good things. I believe it was a couple of decades after the pandemic that Florence became the cradle of the Renaissance. And the story, you will know it better than I, but the story had something to do with a choice made by the people in the Signoria, the group that ruled Florence, the citadel. and in particular by Lorenzo de' Medici, who was the ruler of the Signoria at the time, who made a very counterintuitive choice. At a time when most citadels were spending money in armies to compete for commerce, trade routes, the members of the Signoria in Florence said, let's actually be, they didn't use this term, but in effect it's what they did, let's be a creative city. Let's be the place where artists and intellectuals choose to come. And that's why you see people like Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo and Machiavello all come to this tiny city. And if you have been to Florence, this beautiful, magnificent city, you see that little square of Florence. You can picture these great minds bumping into each other. And this is the beginning of the Italian Renaissance and eventually of the Renaissance. People who have studied that period call that the Medici effect. And the Medici effect is a very simple idea. Innovation requires bringing together people who see the world differently, bringing together different disciplines, bringing together different talents. The modern research university is the best expression of that idea. What is the modern research university but a small Florence that is trying to produce many Medici effects? So that I think in this pandemic, many teachers got to experience what it was like to be in a little virtual Florence, when they were in conversations with people that they couldn't imagine they would have been in conversation, with colleagues elsewhere in the country, with colleagues in other countries, with colleagues in universities. We have seen more collaboration across institutions in this period than ever in history. And I'm hoping this will continue. And I think there is a very, very important role for universities to play that in sustaining it. Right now, I have recently finished a project studying how 25 universities around the world played a leadership role connecting with schools and school systems, trying to invent together solutions to sustain education during these. In effect, how they became small Florences, virtual Florences, to try to produce an education renaissance. And then lastly, I think we're going to see more reliance on partnerships. We're going to realize that the big problems in education cannot be solved by a tiny institution like a school. They require collaboration. They require a different scale. They require mobilizing more institutional capacity than is present in a school. So I think these are some of the good things that happen in the middle of this terrible global calamity. Particularly in terms of education, what do I think are going to be some of the trends, some of the important interests that we're going to focus on? One, the notion that schools should develop a breadth of skills, not just a few skills. Now, these ideas are not entirely new. These ideas of education for the 21st century had been around for at least several decades, but the pandemic has made it so visible how important they are. I think there's going to be a lot more interest on purpose. How is it that schools help people develop a purpose? You know, when you look at data collected by the OECD through the PISA surveys, in those surveys, young people are asked, does your life have meaning? Does your life have purpose? You know what percentage of the people say that they don't see any purpose for their life? A third. One full third of the people, at the best time in the history of humanity, at the age of 15, don't have a purpose. How do you do anything if you don't have a purpose for your life? So I think we're going to see schools become a lot more interested in developing that. There's going to be, I think, a lot more interest in cultivating ethics, in helping people think about norms that can help us get along with one another and coexist in peace and relate to the planet in a way that is sustainable. I think there is definitely going to be more interest in preparing people for the unknown, in much greater interest in deeper learning and continuous learning, lifelong learning. There's going to be more interest in personalization. We've seen how different circumstances children experience. I believe we're going to see more interest in problem and project-based education. And with that, there's going to be interest in curriculum and in pedagogy, in teachers as professionals, in schools as learning collaborations, and there's going to be interest in more connections and collaborations between schools and other institutions. And that brings me to the topic of our conversation, which is the topic of the series of this course, because I think the Sustainable Development Goals are just the perfect gateway to connect all these dots that are here. If we find a way to align education with the achievement of these goals, we will develop all these, we will achieve all these goals. Now, let me explain what I mean. I am not suggesting that we should teach students that there is something called the Sustainable Development Goals Compact, that it was approved at the General Assembly of the UN in 2015, that it was approved as a result of the most inclusive and participatory process the UN has ever experienced. I'm not even suggesting that we should tell students that there is a goal named no poverty, or that we should tell them what poverty is and how do you measure it and how much progress there has been. All those things are important. They're really just the foundation. They're just the most basic level of knowledge. If we only do that, we will not achieve these goals. What we need to do is we need to ask, what are the competencies that people need to develop so that they can contribute to a world without poverty? What is it that people need to know, to be able to do, and to care about so they can advance a world in which no one is hungry, in which everyone has health and well-being, in which there is gender equality? So I think goal number 4, which is quality of education, and I'm going to refer to it in a moment, is really a pillar to all the other 17 goals, but not in the sense that we should teach those goals. We should teach in a manner that helps people develop the capacities to achieve those goals. Let me give you an example of what that would mean. With my students, a year ago, we decided to do something about climate change. At least 6 of these goals are about climate change, but let's look at goal number 12. So we said, well, one of the things that we need to address climate change is people need to behave differently, individually and collectively. We need to make different choices. We need to get our governments to make different choices. We need to design cities in different ways. We need to think differently about consumption. So we said, let's look at what schools teach about this issue. So we looked at existing research on climate change education. And you know what we found? Most of it was simply teaching the science of climate change, which is important, but it doesn't tell anybody what to do. And we said, no, if you read the reports of the International Panel on Climate Change, you realize it's very easy to see what are the competencies that people need to mitigate, adapt to, and revert climate change. Yes, you heard me well, revert climate change, not just adapt to it. So let me give you an example. The example comes from Bill Gates. Bill Gates has spent the last 10 years thinking about how do we dispose of waste on this planet, because that is one of the things that causes climate change. So he has looked at how do we dispose of human waste, the waste that we generate. I imagine most of you use toilets. I use a toilet too. Toilet is an old technology that was invented many years ago. I don't know where, probably in Rome. But toilets require water and they require drainage systems. Only 10% of the world population disposes of their waste in that way. If we try to create toilets and water-based drain systems for 100% of the world population, the impact on climate change would be a disaster. So Bill Gates said, we need to find toilets that don't need water. And that's what he has been working on. By the way, you may be interested in these. I think about 7 or 8 years ago, he approached several universities and he said, can you help me invent a new toilet? And many of them said, we're not interested. Now think about this. How could you not be interested in helping find a solution to one of the most important problems affecting our survival, our very possibility of survival? So no wonder some people are asking, what good do universities do for society? But then let's go back to the question. If we are going to educate people for climate change, not in universities, because only 10% of the world population goes to universities, in elementary schools, which is where everybody is, we're going to have to teach them not only the science of climate change, we're going to have to teach them the engineering, the science, the imagination, the creativity, to be able to contribute to doing things like inventing new toilets that don't need water. And so I realized what the limitations of the existing curricula were. And I concluded with my students that what we needed were curricula that could be implemented in particular jurisdictions, because the impact of climate change is different in Boston than it is in Rome, than it is in Rio de Janeiro, than it is in Addis Ababa. And so we said, but the reason there is no good curriculum taught there is because the schools don't have the capacity by themselves to do that. And we said, we need to create a protocol that makes it possible for a university to connect with a school, develop a curriculum that works, and in that way begin to educate those children effectively. And then we need to evaluate it. So I developed that protocol. It's very simple. And then I tested it with my students. The protocol says a group of students selects one place in the world, and they study all the science about what kind of impact is climate change having there. And then they figure out what is it that people need to learn, to care about, and to be able to do to mitigate, adapt to, and revert climate change. Then they say, what is the main deliver vehicle to do that? Is it adult education? Is it school education? Is it education on the job? Then they build a partnership with an institution. They develop that curriculum, they teach it, and they evaluate what happened. And when they finish, they make the results public and make it part of the academic discourse. So that's what we did in this book. I think that you have on your chat a link to the book. You can download it. It's an open access book. This book was published in December. It has been downloaded 7,500 times. Now think about that. This book was written by students, by my students, testing an approach. So just one professor with their students could produce that. We have 40,000 universities in the world. Imagine if only 10% of them, 4,000, did this every year. We would produce in 1 year more resources to support effective climate change education than all the resources available in the world today. This is the order of magnitude of the contributions that universities can do. And it's not professors, it's professors working with their students in partnership with schools. So I hope you understand this is just one example of what I think universities could be doing for all of these goals that we have here. I will be releasing this week, you can find me on Twitter, a book which I have done with my students that illustrates the same thing. So for the last semester, in a course I teach on education policy, I realized that governments at various levels were desperate, were in need of assistance figuring out how to support the education of their students. And so my students, this is a class that has about 50 students, in teams worked as consultants to governments in 10 different countries. And for an entire semester, they did two things. They said, what problem are you concentrating on? They examined the causes of the problem. They identified alternative ways to address it based on existing evidence and science. They assessed them and they made recommendations, and then the governments adopted it. And then we wrote that, and we will be publishing that as a book next week. In fact, we're going to release that book at a conference of ministers of education convened by UNESCO next week. So that's what I hope to see every university around the world doing. I hope to see every university in which students and faculty roll up their sleeves, look outside the windows, look at the problems of society, and ask, how can I help? How can we use our imagination, our creativity, the tools of science, the discipline of organized thought to help solve real problems that affect most of humanity? So let me go back then to the question of education and what are some of the changes we need to achieve. I referred earlier to these surveys conducted by the OECD, and I just want to show these were data collected in 2018. And what they show is how much we still need to do. So these are 15 years old who were asked, are you happy with your life? And what you see is great variation across countries. In Kazakhstan, 87% of the students are happy with their lives. But in Brunei, in Turkey, in Macau, in Japan, in Hong Kong, less than half of the students are happy with their lives. So how could this possibly be? That at this time in history, there is so much pain, so much misery, so much unhappiness. I think this is now something, in the case of Italy, it's 67% of the students are happy with their lives. That's good, but that means 1 in 3 students is unhappy with their lives. How can this be? And students were asked in the same survey, have you been the victim of violence in your school? Have you been bullied? And look at how many students say they have been bullied. In Italy, it's 25%. How is it possible that 1 in 4 Italian students, when they go to school to be humiliated, to be harassed, to be abused by their peers? This is unacceptable that this is what is happening in our schools. Students were asked, does your life have meaning or purpose? And yes, most students say that their life has meaning or purpose, but look at how many of them, on average, 30% say they don't. In Italy, only 67% of the students say that their life has meaning or purpose. My expectation is that after this pandemic, we all realize that this is where education should begin, that education should help people develop satisfaction with their life, in fact, a plan for their life, that no one should be a victim to abuse in an educational institution, that education should be about helping people discover a purpose bigger than themselves. And the examples I have given you of how I have engaged my students in solving problems are designed to help them find a purpose, that is bigger than themselves, to help them understand that they can become not only architects of their own lives, but contributing members of their communities. I believe every university should do this for every student, and every school should do this for every student. And I am certain that if universities collaborate with schools, they will become a lot more effective in doing this for all of their students. Now, to go back to the surveys of the OECD, these are surveys administered to teachers, in which they are asked essentially how they teach. And the bottom line of that story is that most teachers say that what they do very well is lecture, just like I'm doing right now. What they don't do very well is to organize students in groups, to have them solve real problems, to have them collaborate. So for example, when teachers are asked, when you teach, do you summarize what you recently taught? Most teachers do that. That's good. In the case of, I was just going to show you, in the case of Italy, here it is. Do you present a summary of what was recently taught when you teach your students? I think in Italy, 80% of the teachers do that. That's fantastic. Too bad for the other 20%. Do you set goals at the beginning of your classes? 80%, 82% of the teachers in Italy do that. In the US, same number. Do you explain to your students what you want them to learn? Most teachers do that. In Italy, it's again 82%. That's pretty good. Do you explain to your students how old topics and new topics are related? Again, most teachers do that. In Italy, it's over 90%. That's fantastic. But look at how things change when teachers are asked, do you give your students a task that has no obvious solution? The percentage drops dramatically. It's like we're trying to protect our students so much that we make them weak. In Italy, only 45% of the teachers do that. Compare that to 90% of the teachers who have no problem lecturing. It's like they don't trust that students are capable of finding solutions to problems. Do you provide your students tasks that require them to think critically? Again, percentage is lower, big variation. Do you have your students work in small groups to solve a problem? In Italy, under 50%. How can you do anything in this world if you don't know how to collaborate? And how are you going to learn to collaborate if you don't practice collaboration in your schools? When teachers are asked, do you ask students to decide on their own how to solve a problem? Again, in Italy, only 40%, barely over 40% of the teachers do that. Do you give students a problem that requires at least 1 week to complete? Again, look at the percentage, how low it is, and how much variation there is between countries. In Italy, only 20% of the teachers provide their students a problem that requires at least a week to complete. How can you function in this world if you don't learn to persevere? Can you imagine for the students that didn't have this capacity to learn independently, to be self-directed, can you imagine how much they must have suffered when they had to learn at home because they couldn't come to school. So I'm hoping that the SDGs are going to help us reimagine what teaching and learning looks like. And I'm going to offer some suggestions and actually an invitation for you to take action. Over the last several years, I have been working with my graduate students developing curriculum aligned with the SDGs. And I've published that in 3 books. They're very easy to find. I'm going to refer today to only 2 of them. The first one is the World Course. The World Course is a course I invented in which I said, if we want people to gain these capacities, this is how we do it. First of all, here are some organizing principles. You have to first think about the end goal, what you hope students to learn. Then you have to create many opportunities for students to engage in projects over an extended period to collaborate, and you have to trust them that they will be able to find solutions to challenging issues. The emphasis has to be on action-based learning. You're going to develop a breadth of skills. These projects are going to lead to something good. The students in this course develop business plans. They develop campaigns. These students actually at the end of the course have achieved something that produces a change in the world, something like a book that actually 7,000 people can learn from. These are coherent yearly themes that promote interdisciplinary learning. There is a lot of new knowledge. You know what? There is one unit in the World Course called public health. You know what the first topic of that unit is? Pandemics. Now, we wrote that book 7 years ago. Why? Because you cannot understand our world if you don't understand how a pandemic works. There is a unit, there is a course in that World Course on demographic dynamics. Why? Because you can't understand this world if you don't understand demographic flows. There is a course there on democracy and the fragility of democracy and cases of breakdown of democracy in history. Why? Because democracy will not survive if people don't understand how it functions and how it has broken down in history. Now, the goal of this course is to foster student agency, the ability, the desire to make a difference, initiative. The idea is to teach students to learn from what works, to help them develop an innovative spirit, to get parents and communities as resources. The emphasis is on the development of analytic and problem-solving skills. Global challenges and human rights are the focus. A lot of connections between global and local. We engage students with complex issues, messy issues that have no easy answers. It's appropriate to their age, begins in kindergarten, but it's not infantilizing. It begins with the premise that students are smart. Our premise is that students will rise to our highest expectations for them, or they will descend to our lowest expectations for them too. They can do that as well. So it's better to assume that students are smart than the alternatives. It goes from the personal and immediate to more advanced and conceptual understanding. So just very quickly, because you can read these books, I trust that you're independently driven learners and you will be curious to read that. So we basically organize this profile of the graduate of this course in 3 big buckets. First bucket is intercultural competency, 3 subdivisions: interpersonal, intrapersonal, ethics. Second bucket, knowledge and skills: economics, trade, culture, politics, science, technology, public health, demography, business, and work and mind habits. Let me remind you, this is not a course for university students. This is a course for students in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, all the way through high school. For each of these categories, we break them down into operational definitions that make it very clear what we mean. So for example, what do we mean by interpersonal, intercultural competency? The capacity to recognize and weigh diverse cultural perspectives, understanding their own identity and the identities of others, the ability to work productively and lead effectively teams that are intercultural, including doing work remotely, collaborating online, the capacity to put yourself in the shoes of someone else, understanding cultural variation, and so on. And the same for all of them. So we end up with about 120 constructs like that. The beauty of those constructs is that if you have clarity about what you're trying to teach, developing the pedagogical opportunities to learn that is actually very simple. So essentially, what's the big idea in this book? The big idea is a very simple tool to make it possible to test the 2 hypotheses on which any curriculum is built. And those hypotheses are, if we teach A, our students will learn B. And if students learn B, the consequences to themselves or to their communities or to their societies will be X, Y, and Z. Now, in my experience, it's only the most reflective educators who ever take the time to come back and test these hypotheses. Is it true that if my students gain these competencies, they will contribute to those goals? Is it true that if I engage my students in these experiences, they will gain these competencies? By offering a framework and a language, what we have done is to make it possible for the testing of these hypotheses to be public knowledge, and therefore to be knowledge that can advance the profession. However, this book generated a lot of interest. There are schools that teach this curriculum. There is a whole network of schools that was built to teach this curriculum. First year of publication, 20,000 copies of this book were sold in English. But the only good thing that came from that for me is that I realized that I was wrong. I was wrong in assuming that if you simply change the curriculum, you could change the school. How do I know I was wrong? Because I heard from so many people who tried to implement it and told me there were basically two problems. Number one, my vision that we should create a new course called the World Course and devote 10 hours a week, every week from the first week of kindergarten until the last week of high school, that's not an option for most schools. They just cannot do it. The second thing that was wrong is I had assumed that the teachers had the knowledge to teach these things, but I heard from many who said, my teachers don't understand pandemics. How can they teach pandemics? My teachers don't understand demography. They cannot teach demography. So I realized that we needed something else. We needed a simpler version, and we needed a tool to make it possible to change the culture of the school in a way that built capacity. So I published these books, and you can find them in English and in Italian. Underneath is the link where you can find them. I'm going to tell you in a second what these books do, and then I'm going to talk to you about the group of teachers who actually in Italy, part of a network called the Rete Dialogue, who work with me producing the Italian version of that book. So what the book contains is very simple. A simple protocol that explains how do you go from these goals to the profile of a graduate, and how do you go from that to designing a curriculum. Then a protocol to create space in the school, create institutional space to actually teach such an innovation. And then lastly, an example, a prototype, 60 lessons, 5 lessons per grade. What is this school-wide strategy? It's a very simple 13-step process. You need to put a team in charge. And so the book discusses who should be on the team. They have to study these goals and understand them deeply. They then have to think about this profile of the graduate. Then they have to use that to examine what do we now do that is aligned with it. Then they have to decide what are we going to do next? What's a small step we can take that can move us in the direction of achieving our goals? Then you have to communicate. Then they have to actually develop an implementation strategy. They have to figure out what do we need. Then they have to monitor the implementation. They have to communicate. They have to make sure that their teachers can develop the skills to do that. Then they have to do it. Then they evaluate it. And then they go back and the next year they do it better. So what this tool does is offer a framework for a process of continuous improvement where it is possible for the teachers in a school to evaluate these two hypotheses. If we teach these lessons, our students will learn these, and if they learn these, they will achieve the following. But now they can learn in the company of others. They can learn as part of a network. So when this book was published, I heard from Giovanna Barzano, who said, we love this book. It's very much aligned with what we're doing. We want to translate it in Italy, in Italian. And I said, well, I think that's fine, but I want you to adapt it to Italy. Use it in your network, because these 60 lessons are just a point of entry into a much deeper conversation about how do we transform education. Anyway, I'm delighted of what these teachers did with the Italian version, which you can read. But with this second book, I was also wrong. The first time I thought if you change the curriculum, you change the school, you change the world. Then I thought if you create a process of change management, you change the culture of the school, you change the world. And then I realized that if you wanted to do these at scale for an entire country, for an entire system, you needed more than a curriculum and change management. You needed especially the capacity to see the world through the eyes of others. Because a big education reform is fundamentally an exercise in communications. It's an exercise in which many people have to agree. And it would be naive to assume that other people see the world the way you do. And so what I've done in this book is to offer 5 ways to see the process of change. Get used to say that the person who speaks only one language sees the world with one eye. And what 2 eyes give us is the possibility of seeing depth, perspective. What 5 perspectives give us is the possibility to see much greater texture, many more colors, better understanding of the process of change. So what are these perspectives that this book talks about? The reason I think those perspectives are important, the reason why I think communication tools are necessary, is because when you think about the process of change, if it remains in the classroom, may give something interesting for the student to think about, but it's not going to produce a lot of lasting change. The classroom is embedded in a department, which is embedded in a school, which is embedded in a system. If the process of innovation, if the zone of global education remains at the classroom level, it's like putting a little yellow stick on the refrigerator door. It can remind you of something, but over time, it falls down. If you want the zone of global education to take the entire system, then you need to bring many other people along. And to do that, you need to see the process of change multidimensionally. What are those dimensions? Number 1 is culture. Educational institutions don't operate in a vacuum. They interact with other institutions. Community, family, religious institutions, employers, civic organizations, political parties. They're in conversations with them. And they need to be gentle in bringing all those institutions along. I think this pandemic has reminded us of the power of that, has reminded us that if there isn't good collaboration between the school and the family rules. And if there are big divisions in the cultural capital of families, those divisions are going to be reflected in the opportunities that students have to learn. What is psychological perspective? It's about mobilizing everything that we know about how people learn, students and teachers, and using it to design powerful curriculum. The National Research Council in the US has synthesized some of that knowledge in these 2 volumes, which you can find online. What's a professional perspective? It's understanding that powerful pedagogy, deeper learning, is not a task for amateurs. It's something that requires expertise, that requires professionalism. So how do you build professionalism? You create norms, you create standards, you create opportunities for expert knowledge to inform practice. You create opportunities for practitioners to reflect on their practice, right? You close the gap between existing capacities and needed capacities to be more expert. What's an institutional perspective? It's understanding that an education system is a set of interlocking processes and components that need to be coherently aligned. If you only change the curriculum, but you don't change the assessment, or you don't provide opportunities for teachers to learn new skills, not much is going to change. And what's a political perspective, finally? It's understanding that an education system involves many, many people. And each of those persons comes to the enterprise of education reform with a set of hopes, of aspirations about what a good world is. And you need to create a consensus, the possibility to have enough support, political support for a reform to last long enough to produce ultimate change in transforming schools. Let me just conclude sharing with you some of the work I do with my students. So in this book, which examines the detail of implementing deeper learning reports, this was done with my students in a course on policy in which we identified one of the big gaps in knowledge was understanding the details of making the implementation of these big ambitious reforms happen. And we basically produced that. I'm going to skip that. There is one of the other things that we need, of course, is attention to teacher education to achieve that. And that has been the focus. I just need a few more minutes and I'm finishing. Has been the focus of the initiative I lead, the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which is a research and practice collaborative that has the goal of advancing understanding of how education leaders and practitioners define and practice teaching and learning that is relevant to the 21st century. We advance those goals doing three interrelated things. We conduct applied research, we promote informed dialogues, and we develop practical tools such as the curriculum that I have shared with you to support effective practices. I have so far published 8 books, and we have 3 more books in publication. We have also convened a number of dialogues to help education leaders and practitioners learn together, and we have developed practical tools. And all of these I have done with my students, which I think is a reminder, it's an example of how the university can integrate the functions of teaching, research, and outreach in helping to construct knowledge that can help us tackle some of the most challenging, some of the most serious challenges that we face, and helping us advance a world in which we can relate to one another in a way that is respectful, that is sustainable, that is peaceful, and in which we can relate to the planet also in a way that is sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Reimers, for this really inspiring and deep lecture. Yes, we make a virtual applause, which is not the same as a real applause, but I think you can guess the meaning. And we got a lot of I would say enthusiastic feedbacks from the audience, so many interesting questions, and I think also the speakers panel has got some many interesting ideas to discuss. I took a lot of notes as well to to start to animating the debate. Before looking at some of the questions that we have got and we collected from the chat, let me just ask to Professor Fiorucci and Professor De Filippis if they want to add anything, if they have any specific comments after the lecture, or shall we first go to the audience, to the students, and give the floor to our so dedicated and smart students?
I suggest to go straight on to the question of students because they are very interesting.
I agree.
Perfect. I started to scroll down the chat for questions, and I started to looking at some of them, but we have more and more questions popping up. But I will start from a few of them, going like in chronological order. I was also looking at if we can possibly group some of the questions together if they touch similar issues. So this is something that I have tried to do. But I will start from one of the very first questions that we had, which is a question by Giulia Angelucci. I don't know, Fernando, if you can read the chat.
I don't see the chat. The chat that I'm looking at doesn't have that. The last thing that I see, yeah.
I will tell you how to do it, but of course I will animate. If you go to the top side of the screen, you will see some of the icons. One is with the participant, the other one is the speaker panel chat, and then there is one with a interrogative dot, so question mark. There's an icon with a
show Q&A. Okay, so I'm looking at that now. Live event Q&A, right?
Yeah. Then if you go to published questions, you will see.
I get it now. I get it. Fantastic. Okay. Thank you.
So I think a very interesting and very direct question is the one that was posed by Giulia Angelucci, who basically says, based on what you do and what you said in the first part of your lecture, what can we do to reduce the risk of a new world war as a consequence of this time pandemic? And if I may add, you mentioned not only the war, but in generally the rising of
fascism, the rising of fascism. Exactly. I think that the real risk of our time is the rise of fascism. It's very clear. It's very clear in the United States, and it's very clear in other countries around the world. Yeah.
Exactly. So war and totalitarianism are always part of the same issue, and they rise together. So, in your opinion, what shall we do right now to prevent this risk in this very critical moment for the entire world?
I don't think there is a single thing, but I do think that helping make sure that we address the challenges of social inclusion and that we address the challenges of democracy, functioning of democracy, is very important. And so what do I mean by social inclusion? Obviously, there are some people that are very much pushed to the margins, and everyone should be interested in making possible that everyone has a certain dignity, and that there is solidarity in a society that people manifest, so that no one feels so desperate that they have nothing to lose. In terms of democracy, there is a lot I think we need to do to actually become active upstanders of democracy. Understand that democracy thrives not only when people vote every 4 or 5 years, but democracy is alive when in our daily acts we behave in a manner that respects democratic institutions, that engages. Now, I believe that educational institutions can do a lot to advance those two things. Schools can do a lot to provide people with the skills that will make it possible for them to provide for themselves, and that will teach them how to be upstanders for democracy. But as I suggested, I don't think schools alone have the capacity to do that. I think schools need help. I think the Rete Dialogue is a brilliant example that recognizes that you can do a lot more in a network than you can do alone. And in their case, this network has an organization of civil society animating them, and also has university faculty like Professor Fiorucci working with them. That's a wonderful model, but that's only 100 teachers. We need to make this possible for every teacher. And I think in that sense, students can do a lot. The reason I chose to frame my talk, which I knew was on SDG number 4, the way I did. I could have given you a lecture just on all the necessities of education around the world. And instead, I focus on the kinds of things that students can do. Is because I have the hope that each and every one of you attending here can do something. You can do more with your peers, you can do more with your professors, but you don't need to wait for them to give you permission. Each of you can approach a school and can say, how can I help here? And you will identify needs in the school. You will identify needs, you will identify ways in which you can be helpful. And so that's that would be for me success in this talk. If at least some of you who came walk out of here saying, I'm going to reach out to a school and I'm going to be part of the solution to these risks for democracy. I'm going to make sure that in this school, children, especially vulnerable children, are well educated. And I'm going to make sure that in this school, people gain the skills that are essential for democracy to actually function, which I think are the skills that are reflected in some of that framework. Those are some of the things we can do. They're not the only things to do. I'll give you another example of how universities can do that. Some years ago, one of the areas in which I do a lot of work is on the connection between education and poverty. And so I had traveled to Mexico to look at innovations in poverty alleviation. And it was an exhibit of innovations. There is one that really impressed me tremendously. It was in Mexico, university students have to do a community service for 10 hours a week during, I think, part of their career or something like that. And this university, which was the main public university of the state of Nuevo León, had decided to use that community service as a course on social entrepreneurship. They wanted students to develop the capacity to be innovative in solving problems. So this was a student of engineering, third year, 20 years old. He came to his professor, his advisor, he said, okay, I want to focus on poverty. And the advisor said, very good. You need to define that a little bit more clearly. The way you solve a big problem is you break it down into a small piece. Poverty where? find a place and go there and spend some time there so you understand poverty. So this 20-year-old went to a low-income community 2 hours away from the city, and he really understood the phenomenon rather quickly. There's a lot of migration from the south to the north of Mexico. South is rural, indigenous, poor. North has the factories, wealthy. So all these young people come to work in the factories without their families. So these young men and women fall in love in the factories. The girls get pregnant, and many of the men disappear. They don't know the girl anymore. They don't want anything to do. So this girl has a baby. Now she cannot come to the factory, and she has no family, and she's ashamed. So she becomes very poor, and the baby becomes very poor. So this 20-year-old said, okay, what can I do to solve this problem? He said, why do they have to come to the factory? Is there a factory that can come here? And he realized that producing soap, liquid soap, is actually very simple. It's about mixing water with some chemicals in the right proportions. He got a small loan, $5,000, got a small structure in that low-income community, taught these women to make soap, and these women, at the end of a 3-month course, had become small business owners selling soap. I visited some of these women in their homes. I never knew someone could be so happy producing soap. And it wasn't just, they were earning at the end of 3 months, 1 minimum wage. Now, a minimum wage is not a lot of money in Mexico, but to go from earning 0 to earning 1 minimum wage is an amazing return. Now, who was the biggest winner in this case? The student, the 20-year-old who discovered at the age of 20 that he could change forever the lives of these women and their babies simply because he had asked himself, what can I do? And obviously because he had a professor and a university that supported him. This is what every university could do in the world. This is what every university should do in the world if we're going to achieve these goals.
Thank you. Thank you. I will follow some more questions. I'm afraid with our super enthusiastic audience, we will have to pick up some of the. We cannot deal with all the questions because you are too smart, guys. So you make too many questions. So I'm joking, of course, but that's a good challenge also for us. So please don't be sad if we cannot deal with all the questions, and if your specific question will not be picked up, but we will have time to come back also on these topics in the smaller group meeting and classes that we will do. So, but next question is from Clara Lopez, which pose a problem related to the situation in the United States, but I think this applies to the entire to the global community. To Fernando, you mentioned studies which shows that people's trust in university education is decreasing. And so Clara want to ask, first of all, if you have an idea on the reasons why this trend is happening, and of course, solutions. I may add to this question that we have been encountering this kind of trend also in a very specific field. For example, myself, I have done some studies on denial of climate change, and we have found that also denial of climate change is some kind of specific manifestation of this more general, let's say, lack of trust in science. And we have found, for example, that political orientation, particularly extreme right-wing authoritarianism, is also related with this. And then, of course, the question of Clara and my question also is education. We think education is crucial in this sense, not just the information providing, as you said, but a global approach, a comprehensive approach to education, I believe.
I agree, Giuseppe. I have just posted. Are the students able to see what I'm posting on the chat? Can they see that? So I posted a link to a study of the Pew Research Organization on this issue. Do you guys see that, which I have posted or not?
Did you post in the chat or in the question and answer?
In the question and answer.
I'm not sure if they can see. But
Yes, it is. Yes, Yes, there
they
is.
can see it. Okay, so that's the answer for Clara. That's the study, and you're right, Giuseppe. The decline is much greater among politically conservative groups. Absolutely right. And when I talk about a cultural perspective, that's exactly what I mean. It's impossible to teach climate change in a community of climate change deniers if you don't figure out a strategy to involve the community. It doesn't mean you should not teach it. It means you need a sophisticated strategy to also teach the adults, to also involve the adults in the process. I also posted in the chat that I know that there are tons of questions and I may not be able to get to all of them, but if you send to me the questions on Twitter, I suspect many of you are on Twitter here, and very easy to find. I will promise to answer the questions tonight, before tonight for me. So just send it to me on Twitter, okay? So yeah, I think I don't think education is the only answer to these very grave challenges that we have, but it's a very, very important answer. And I am convinced, I cannot stress this enough, that universities have a special responsibility not only to educate their own students, to connect with the rest of the education system. When you look at the creation of the modern research university in 1811, when the University of Berlin was chartered by Humboldt, this was created at the same time that the first public education system was created. And these three institutions, democracy, public universities, and schools, public schools, were sisters, Siamese sisters. They were supposed to reinforce one another. No one of them works well if the other two do not function. And so I think that's my call today to those of you in universities, to assume the responsibility to play a role in sustaining public schools and in sustaining democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Fernando. Well, there is a question which I would also like to underline, which is about Africa. And of course, the question is, what are the causes of the poor level of school education? But I will say that, you know, the causes are rooted in very long historical tragedies. But the second part of the question to me is more interesting. I don't know if you agree. And because it says who are the potentially most influential actors in bridging this gap? For example, United Nations or other kind of actors, the national governments, institutions like universities, the civil societies, whatever.
So
and
I
say Africa or any other, let's say, a region of the world where we know that the education level is so below the expectancy and our desires.
So this is one area. Let me first say the obvious, which is how much good has happened in education in Africa and in the rest of the world in the last few decades. It may not be obvious, but the pandemic makes it obvious. When Kenya said, we're not able to sustain education remotely, we're just going to close the schools, everybody realized how much good the schools were doing in ordinary times. Doesn't mean they're perfect. They have a long way to go. They have a lot to improve. But the reality is that, you know, in 1945, at the end of World War II, when people look back at all this horror caused by the war, they ask, how do we make sure this never happens again? And a phenomenal act of imagination, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, changed the world for the better, including the right of education, naming education as a right, right? The declaration was adopted 47, I think. At that moment, there were 2.5 billion humans on the planet. Only 45% had gone to school. Today, there are 7.8 billion. 95% have gone to school for a number of years, including in the poorest countries in the world. That is amazing. This is the most important revolution experienced by humanity. It's a quiet revolution. We don't talk about it. We don't celebrate it enough, and we should, because it's a celebration of the power of imagination and of the power of collective leadership, the power of a global movement where all kinds of actors decide, yes, this is important, let's make it happen. Now, who are the actors? Obviously, you have governments. They're very important. Governments have different levels. You have city governments, you have state governments, you have national governments, and you have supranational institutions. You have institutions like the European Community, you have the OECD, you have the United Nations. They play a very important role. All of these play a role. But then you also have civil society, organized in different ways, in NGOs, in businesses, in voluntary groups. Together they produce these changes. I do think, however, that technology is transforming the opportunities for people like you and me to participate, to have extraordinary power. So I have been serving on the UNESCO Commission on the Futures of Education. UNESCO has only 3 times in its history put together a commission to do that. First 2 times, the audience for this commission were governments. And the most recent one was in the 1990s, which means that at that time, those in the commissions thought, who matters? It's only governments. That's not how we're thinking, because we realize that the world is experiencing a very important shift in power, from power as the ability to exercise influence as the monopoly of large organizations, whether they are governments or corporations, to power as the ability of ordinary people connected in networks through technology to have extraordinary impact. Look at the power of even global movements. Look at the power of Malala. Malala began as a girl at the age of 11, using technology to write a blog in which she didn't even write her name. And look at the power that she generated. She doesn't sit in any big office, any big company. I think that any of you has today more power than any human has had in history, because you have a mobile and you have access to the internet. And if you're smart and you can, now this kind of power, there is no special virtue in it. This power can be used for horrible goals. Al-Qaeda uses this power. ISIS uses this power. The white supremacists in this country use this power for terrible goals. But this power can also be used to advance these goals. And I invite you to practice the exercise of that power for virtuous goals.
Yeah, thank you. As you say, Arab Springs, for example, say there was an example of this. Then we have the next question is quite specific, but quite interesting to me to hear your point of view, is about brain drain. You know, Italy is a country which is affected by brain drain, so this is a problem we feel so much. But the question of the student Sarah Penge is also how is brain drain seen from the other side of the Atlantic, or if we think the Atlantic as a destination. Anyway, from
I don't hear a lot of conversation about brain drain. I know there was quite an active literature on this topic in the 1970s. You know, I will speak for myself. I do hear a lot more conversations on migration than I do about brain drain. The fact that people are on the move. And people are on the move for a variety of reasons. Most are on the move because there is something that constrains their freedoms or their safety that causes them to move. I would say that I have tremendous sympathy. As someone who was born in Venezuela, my parents were immigrants from Spain. They had left Europe at a time, many people, the country where I grew up, had tremendous influx of immigrants from Spain, Italy, and Portugal. Why did they leave? Well, they left because those economies were terribly depressed in the 1930s and the 1940s. And people were just living to provide for themselves and for their families, and frankly, some of them for an opportunity to reinvent themselves. Those societies at that time were very stagnant societies where social origins were social destiny. And the idea that many immigrants had, including my parents, is that when you migrated, when you left your communities of origin, you earned the freedom to write your own history. And you didn't have that freedom in a country where your social class of origin was your social class of destiny. And so as a son of immigrants in a country that had tremendous influx of immigrations, I certainly have understood that people migrate for all kinds of reasons and have had tremendous sympathy for people who migrate. Now, I myself migrated many years ago to the United States from Venezuela. Right now, there is a humanitarian crisis of Venezuelan migrants for reasons that have to do with the autocratic government in that country that places many people's lives in danger. And of course, I realize that this is a global tragedy that has received insufficient recognition, I think, in the global community. There are almost as many Venezuelan refugees as Syrian refugees. But if you look at the amount of funding from the international community that is supporting the education or health of those children, is a fraction of what goes to any other refugees. This is a complicated story for another time. But certainly when I think about migration, around the world, I think of it as the right of any person to decide to move from a place that constrains their freedoms to a place that expands their freedoms.
Thank you, Fernando. Well, time is running out, so I will ask now to Vice Rector De Filippis and Director Fiorucci if they want to ask a question or comment or add something, and then we will maybe close there.
There are just many questions of students about the effects, negative effects of pandemic on education. And there is Francesca that is asking if there is a risk that teachers become less sympathetic and more severe with students for the anxiety of not having enough time to teach. And if this will have in the long term some effect on the children, this educational gap in the work when they grew.
What's the name of the person who asked the question?
Two questions, Francesca and Francesco.
I think that Francesca and Francesco have asked wonderful questions, and you are a credit to your teachers and to your parents. And what I would invite you to do is to study the answers to the questions. I have been reading the research on this subject, and I haven't seen anyone pursue that question. So my suggestion to you is that you, in the context of a course that you're taking, you talk, maybe in this course, you talk to Professor Carrus and say, I would like to do a study on this issue, and actually write a paper with their help and publish the paper. And after you do that, maybe invite others to do the same, because this is a moment when we have insufficient knowledge on how this pandemic is affecting education. I have not found, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I have just finished the book that includes 10 studies done by 40 of my students, and this book will be published next week. We don't talk about this topic, and in writing that book, I wrote the introduction, I read a lot of research. I haven't encountered any study that examines your question. So my answer to you is, take yourself seriously, take your question and answer it. Do the research to answer it, and then share the results with others.
Thanks for this really brilliant and inspiring challenge, I would say. Director Fiorucci, would you like to add something? Do you have any other points?
No, it's tardy. No, I only want to say many thanks. Thank you, Fernando, for this wonderful lecture, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you so very much.
So I take the chance of this last answer that Fernando gave to Francesco and Francesca to also summarize so many other questions that we couldn't deal with, because they point on the same similar issues, so that it is important to take the challenges of course of the pandemic, but even beyond the pandemic to engage ourselves in difficult tasks, but always open to partnership and to cooperation. And I think the one very important distillate take-home message of Fernando's talk today is also this, that the strength of the cooperation, of the partnership, of the not being scared by difficult tasks, by difficult challenges, whatever is the question, whatever is the problem, the issue at stake. The important is to join together and to try to work for giving our students, first of all, but ourselves, we are always students all lifelong, giving ourselves a purpose, a meaning, a challenge, a task that we want to achieve, and find the resources, put us them all together to win the challenge. So that's my view. I hope I could distillate.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Other questions.
Let me only, in closing, thank you, Giuseppe, Massimiliano, Fabrizio, and all of you who attended this talk. I am so happy to see that you have created this course in the university. I think this is path-breaking. I hope you will take the time to write about this and publish it, share it with others, because you can inspire other universities. And I think it would be so easy in the course that you have already designed to engage your students in collaborations with other institutions of society, beginning with schools, to actually make meaningful progress in advancing those goals. And I think that's the best way to actually understand deeply what those goals are. I think it's only when you try to do something, when you take the risk to commit to action, that you develop deep knowledge of the problem. It's always too easy when you're just sitting and listening or reading. So congratulations to all of you. I admire what you're doing. I think it's very important, not only for you, but for higher education. And you have a friend at the other side of the Atlantic who's rooting for you, who's wishing you success. And if I can be of any help in what you're doing, it'll be my pleasure to do that. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the privilege of your time and your attention.
Thank you so much to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again for participation and contribution. Look forward to meet in person whenever it will be possible.
I look forward to that as well. Thank you. Ci vediamo. Ci vediamo.
Ci vediamo, Fernando.
Bye.
Grazie.
Bye. Bye.
Hasta pronto.
Grazie ancora.
Hasta pronto.